Welcome to the Haftarah Tazria. We are in a biblical leap year this year. This is the year 2022, and because of that, you're going to maybe notice some changes in the structuring of the usual Torah readings, and then that, of course, changes our usual Haftarah readings. So, in most years, the Torah portion Tazria, which is this week's portion, is combined with the next portion called Metzorah, and they're done at the same time. And when this happens, only the Haftarah that's designed for Metzorah is read. Okay. But again, this being a leap year, it's different. So we have the Torah portion and the Haftarah for Tazria stands alone this week. And then next week, we pick up the Torah and the Haftarah for Metzorah. Okay. So why am I telling you this? Well, what this means for us is that we get to dig into a section of the Bible that we don't often come across as a Haftarah section. Okay, so we're reading 2 Kings 4, starting at verse 42, all the way to chapter 5:27. And if you have not already read this, go ahead and do that, because you can pause and do that because we're going to kind of move quickly through the story. So our Haftarah will recount two miracles by the prophet Elisha. And for this lesson, we're going to focus on the second miracle, which is the healing of Naaman the leper. Ah, yes, leprosy. So let's talk about that just for a minute, because leprosy figures prominently in our story. It also figures prominently in the Torah portion, which is why that's the tie-in. That's why this Haftarah matches with the Torah portion. They both talk about Za'arat. So what is Za'arat? Well, that's the Hebrew word that we translate leprosy. And because we've translated it leprosy, most people think that that is what we today know as leprosy, the official name being Hansen's disease. But they're actually not the same. So Hansen's disease is brought about by like naturally occurring thing, bacterium. Okay. And apparently Hansen's disease was unknown in the ancient Near East during the time of the Torah and the Haftarah. Apparently it wasn't until like the first century, the first millennium BC, that we would read clear references to what we know as today's leprosy. A little bit more about Za'arat. So the Talmud gives us a number of different reasons for this. And it's interesting that they're all kind of like antisocial sins. So we've got gossip and murder, perjury, arrogance, egotism, theft, envy, speaking ill against somebody. We know that as Lashon Hara. So when I've studied this out before, the basic understanding that I have is that Za'arat was this supernatural phenomenon that was meant to cause people to reevaluate their behavior and turn back to God in His ways. Um, so when reading about Naaman, he's not an Israelite and he's not part of the covenant of God, or at least wasn't in the beginning. So that kind of made me wonder, well, how does that fit in? I kind of thought Za'arat was more tied to the presence of God in the tabernacle and the temple. So I'm not 100% sure how all that fits in. But from what I've read, this Za'arat encompasses a number of, it's like almost like a blanket term for a number of skin diseases of the ancient times. And some of those diseases, it wasn't just the Israelites that were affected. So we can look at Naaman Za'arat, though, I think, in terms of it being a catalyst for change. It seems like that's the text, that's where it's leading us to. We can look at it as like a supernatural wake-up call for Naaman to examine himself, modify his behavior, maybe before things get worse. Um, So before we get into like the meat of the story of Naaman, I'm going to just go ahead and cut to the chase and give you the moral of the story. The moral of the story um, is that Za'arat is reversible, and so are our character flaws. There's this interesting larger story that unfolds in our Haftarah, and it's the overarching story where Naaman's healing kind of sits within it. And we're only going to see this larger story when we consider where the story of Naaman begins. Okay. So his story begins with the telling of the capture of a young Jewish girl. Now, the Syrian or the Aramean army, they kidnap this young girl in one of their raids into Israelite territory. So, what's going on here? So, during this time, Israel um, was faced with frequent skirmishes and like border disputes with a neighboring nation, the nation of Aram. And these disputes were over like the who controlled those important trade routes. And apparently at this time there was some kind of like an uneasy truce of sorts between these two nations, but that didn't stop the raiding parties from happening, and it was quite a problem. So this young Israelite girl, she's captured, and you know, put yourself in her position. She's ripped from her home, from her family, from her friends, from her culture, from her God, everything that she knows, and she becomes a servant to Naaman's wife. Now, I've read a couple of commentaries that note similarities between her story and the Joseph story. I'm not going to go into all of those, but they're very interesting. I just want you to be thinking of that as we kind of continue through and talk about her story. See if you can, maybe want to jot down some of the similarities between those two stories. Especially think in terms of think of her actions and then what that final result of her actions were. And we're going to touch on that here in just a little bit. Okay. But remember, keep in mind that it was her insistence that Naaman go to Israel's prophet to be cured of Za'arat. And Naaman does this. And then he has this incredible, life changing experience, right? Now, to get to the end of this girl's story, we've got to go a little bit beyond the Haftarah reading to get to the conclusion of the story of this nameless female Israelite. So the story of this girl ends actually in chapter 6, verse 23. So this is after Naaman was healed, and it says, the bands of Aram or Syria stopped raiding Israel's territory. So, which is huge. There's peace in the area, peace in the region as a result of what this young girl did and her advice. So, what this means from a literary standpoint is that the main story is this girl's kidnapping, and the story concludes with this reconciling of what were before hostile nations. So that's really the larger story here. And Naaman's story of healing that kind of fits within this larger story. So who's the main hero of the Haftarah, right? You know that all adventure stories have heroes, right? Well, it's this young woman. She's a nameless girl, and that's interesting and that's significant. So, literary speaking in the scriptures, if you want to emphasize something, you might see repetition of a word or a phrase or an action. But on the flip side of that, specifically not mentioning a person's name, that literarily speaking serves to kind of underscore the insignificance of that person. Now, I don't mean, especially in the case of this young girl, I don't mean insignificance of her as a person, but rather emphasizing that it's something or someone else who's really behind that action. And I'm going to guess, you know, from what we little we do know about this named unnamed girl, I think she would be fine and very happy to acknowledge that it's God who's actually behind all of this, right? Because that's what she's trying to convey to Naaman. It was her incredible faith in her God, the God of Israel, that she was trying to get Naaman to understand. And it was because of that faith that she was able to rise above her circumstances of being a captured slave girl, and rise above and shine, you know, for such a time as this. And yes, I'm thinking Esther too, right? So, the question for us is, what's our time? How might we be called to rise above our circumstances? Now, I read a couple of commentaries about this nameless girl, and I found four themes that we can learn, four things that we can learn from um, from this unnamed girl. And the first one is that she accepted her situation without bitterness or without anger. Now, you've heard me talk before many times about the importance of um, the setting to a biblical story, right? I always say we need to know the context. Well, I also say that each of us, you, me, we have our own setting, our own context that God has like sovereignly placed us in, the setting of our own story in God's grand redemptive plan, right? So, think about where you live, think about the country, think about the state, think about the city, your street, who's your family, um, what are your talents, your personality, think about your physicality. This is your setting, this is your context, the things that you're really good at, the things that you really struggle with. This is your context. So this unnamed girl, she accepted her context, her setting. Why? Well, because she trusted that God was in it. And the second thing we can learn from her is that she retained her faith in God. She didn't stop believing in him just because she had been captured and taken to a pagan culture. She doesn't get bitter at God for placing her in this situation. She acknowledges that he at least allows it. And that wasn't an easy situation. But she didn't let her captivity make her lose sight of God's power and his loving grace in her life. Now, again, doesn't this sound like Joseph? There's a lot of parallels with Joseph. The third thing is that she acted on her faith. It wasn't just all talk. When the opportunity came up for her to speak about God's power, she took it, right? And in this case, it was God's power and how he used the prophet Elisha as a vessel for his healing. Now, imagine what, you know, it, the Torah doesn't say how long she had been captive before this situation with Naaman came up. But think about like what kind of lifestyle she would have exuded where her advice for Naaman to go to a foreign god, that would be heeded by him. I mean, that speaks a lot of her character and how she was valued as a person, right? And then the last thing is her huge compassion for Naaman. She didn't want him to suffer any longer, and she knew her God. She knew that he could heal her, and she knew that he would heal him, right? So the other thing, so a couple of things I want to bring out in this lesson, and one is the lessons we can learn from the unnamed girl. The second is this idea that I want you to see run throughout the whole Haftarah, this idea that it's God's power that runs the world. And we can see that in how she reacted to her situation. We can see that in how she has compassion for Naaman, and the only thing she can offer, the best thing she can offer, is, hey, my God can help you, right? So we see this overarching theme of God's power to run the world. The other way that we see this theme of his power has to do with like the opening lines of this Haftarah, and it says, the king of Aram had a great admiration for Naaman, the commander of his army, because through him the Lord had given Aram great victories. But though Aram was a mighty warrior, he suffered from Za'arat. So right off the bat, we're told that the Lord had given Aram great victories through Naaman. Now, keep in mind, remember that this nation was Israel's sort of like national enemy, right? So this is a clear pointer that God is completely in control of the world that he created. Now, in the beginning of the story, Naaman's depicted as this powerful and this proud man, right? But as the story goes on, we're going to hear of God's humbling this pride and showing God's power instead. So the nameless, the insignificant people, now insignificant in the eyes of the world, but not insignificant to God, right? These are the ones who are used by God, and those that have the power and the money and the authority, well, they're not living maybe as wisely. So that's another lesson. When so let's look a little bit now, having to do with his transformation, Naaman's transformation. So when he first starts to prepare to meet the prophet Elisha, he's going to bring all these gifts with him. It was like 750 pounds of silver, 150 pounds of gold, like 10 changes of elaborate clothing. He brings these as gifts, like he wants to do business with the God of Israel. Okay. Now, of course, this is his approach because this is how he would approach his God. This is what he would expect his God to want. And what he's doing is he's getting himself prepared to buy um, blessings, blessings of maybe forgiveness, blessings of cleansing, physical healing. So it's a transaction in Naaman's mind. He wants to approach the God of Israel in a way that will keep his pride and his status intact. So he's saying, I'll pay for your services rendered, God of Israel. Because what's happening at this point is that Naaman doesn't even have on his radar the idea that he could enter into a lifelong relationship of dependency and covenant with the God of Israel. That's not how his God did business. And he's not even considering that this is a possibility. All he wants at this point, all he thinks he's getting, is temporary help from somebody else's God. Okay? Now, the other thing to note in speaking about this transition from his power and prestige to a humble servant of God is that it says he comes with horses and chariots. And these are symbols of power and authority. But if you notice in the end, after the miracle healing, how does he come back? He walks on foot, and that symbolizes um, this desire to humbly serve instead of, flaunting his power and his position. Now, I want to finish up this lesson by highlighting two additional things that tie together that stood out to me in this Haftarah. Okay, besides the nameless young woman and then that overarching message of God's sovereignty. So the last two things are going to illustrate, again, just how much Naaman had to change, what he had to give up in order to be able to receive the healing that God has wanted for him all along. And these have to do with what Elisha said to Naaman when Naaman first came to him. Um, Elisha has a messenger, sent the messenger to Naaman, and he says, "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan River, then your skin will be restored. You will be healed of your Za'arat." So let's take a look at this. So what Elisha said actually angered Naaman, and it angered him because of Naaman's worldview. So Naaman believed that Israel had the Lord as their God, and Syria had its God, which was the God that Naaman worshipped. And then also living in an agricultural society, what that meant was that the two most important things for the well-being of their country and their people was the quality of the soil and the amount of water to ensure abundant harvests. Okay? Now think of this as you reflect back where Naaman later says, "I want to take some of your soil from Israel. I want to take some of that with me." Okay? So there's this bond between a particular God, the particular land, and the particular people. Okay? Um, Gods were thought of as being sort of territorial gods. So people would serve their God, the God of their land. In exchange for that, that God was thought to bless the people with prosperity, and they would do that. It was thought they would do that through rivers, right? And that makes sense because it's usually through rivers. That's water. It's necessary for crops, right? And that's necessary for the people's survival. So at this time, rivers in the God's territory was important. They were seen as conduits of blessing from that territorial God to the particular people living in that region in order to make the land prosper. So we have the God, the people, and the land. Okay. So when Elisha suggests go to the Jordan, that's in God of Abraham's territory, and 7 times wash 7 times, and your flesh will come again to you, and you'll be clean. What this held huge significance. What this was saying is that each time, with each washing, there was going to be a declaration of trust in Israel's God. Trust in God 7 times, right? 7 times. That's Sheva Pe Amim. The word Sheva means 7, but it also means to take or to make an oath. Interesting, right? And Pe'amim comes from the root word pa'am, and that means to move or footstep. So Naaman was told to walk in the river of the Lord of Israel, bathe, and then walk out, making an oath. And then go back in and bathe again and come out and go back in, making an oath, right? 7 times a total. So Naaman was being asked to make an oath to God each time, 7 times, the number of completion in the Jordan River. So can you see now kind of a little bit more what was really at stake here and what Naaman was being asked to do? He was being asked to not rely on the rivers of his God's territory, but to rely on the river of the Israelite God's territory. This was huge back then. Now, at this point, Naaman doesn't understand yet that God is sovereign over the entire world, for he made it. But he's going to learn that pretty well. It seems that, to you and I, going to the Jordan is kind of a simple thing. But think about it this way. That was a betrayal of the faith of Naaman's fathers. He was being asked to acknowledge with his very footsteps, very actions, that Israel's God could do something that his could not. And you remember, it says, at first, Naaman says, "Aren't the rivers of my God better than any of the rivers of Israel? Why shouldn't I wash in my rivers instead and be healed?" And then it says he turned and he ran, not ran, but he went away in a rage, very angry about that. That's why. So it's one thing to try to get something from another God. In this case, Naaman trying to get something from the God of Israel. But it's another thing entirely to willingly abandon the faith of that God. And it was the Syrian God that he would have Naaman would have assumed as the one who gave him all those military victories. Remember in our Haftarah it specifically says that those victories came from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what was going on here was that Naaman was being denied the ability to pay off the God of Israel for this one favor of healing. He was being denied the ability to then get that done in a business transaction and then go back to his life, his old service to his Syrian God. Excuse me. And it says after this healing, it says, then Naaman and his entire party went back to find the man of God, and they stood before him. And Naaman said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel." So do you understand now a little bit more how radical of a statement that would have been in this polytheistic society? Now think about this. When you replace the word gods with the word powers, which you can do because the word gods is the word El, and one of the meanings of El is powers. So when it says have no gods before me, have no powers before me, so you can replace that. When you do that, think about how radical a statement that would be for you and I to make. Now I know that there are no powers in the world except my God. And I wonder, what will it take for us to make that very same statement that Naaman did? Now I know that there is no God, there's no power in all the world except for mine. See you next week.